Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. As the world's worst surge of COVID begins to abate, and as a 6-7 week lockdown starts to ease, we ask how much damage has this done to the Indian economy? With me to answer that question is the Managing Director and CEO of the Center to Monitor the Indian Economy, Mahesh Vyas. Mr. Vyas, economists usually look at high-frequency data like Google mobility, electricity demand, GST transactions, automobile sales to assess the health of the economy. You've done something very different. You've chosen to look at consumer sentiment as well as unemployment. So let's today start by seeing what sort of story they tell us. Now, data maintained by your organization, the Center for Monitoring the Indian Economy, shows that consumer sentiment has fallen by 15% since March, or rather, forgive me, since the last week of March this year. And you say this fall is comparable to the one seen in March 2020 and May 2020. So can you tell me, what does this mean for the economy?
It means a lot. If people's sentiments are getting worse day by day, then obviously the economy can not see the kind of demand increase it requires to come back to the growth phase. So the consumer sentiment index that we produce is based on a large household survey, and the specific questions that go into this, there are 5 of them, which ask you direct questions like, is your household's income better than a year ago or worse or the same? Do you expect your income to increase a year later? Do you expect the economy to do well? Is this a good time to buy consumer goods? And what will the economy be like in 5 years? So this gives an idea of what households are feeling in terms of their own income, their expectations of their income, and the economy as a whole in the near term and the long term. And if this feeling of the households says that things are getting worse, then it obviously is not a very good sign for the economy to recover from the deep hit that it got in the last year.
In fact, if one digs a little deeper, what your own data suggests about consumer sentiment is that this is not a new problem. It's been there almost for 2 years. Your data shows that consumer sentiment in April 2020 was 57% below what it was in April 2019. And even in April 2021, it is still 49% below what it was in April 2019. And that means that from the start of the pandemic, consumer sentiment has fallen and it hasn't really recovered at all.
That's right. And, this is a very important finding, which requires a lot of attention. A lot of the fast frequency indicators that you mentioned earlier in your earlier question to me are indicating that the economy has recovered, is recovering, and was doing quite well, at least till March. So many indicators, like whether it is GST or it is even steel production till March, electricity generation till recently, even export and import were doing very well. But all these are supply side indicators. If the supplies are doing well and demand is not good, and demand has been very low for the entire 1920 when the supply side indicators are saying we're doing very well, then something is not fitting in. Where is all that power going? Where is all the steel going? Where are all the cars going that were produced till yesterday? I think what we are seeing from the consumer sentiments index number is that there is a limit to what these supply side indicators can take us to. It's an early warning system to say the economy cannot grow because consumers are not happy consumers.
And what you're also saying is that those people who took confidence and assurance from the supply side indicators that you mentioned actually ended up with a somewhat misleading picture of the economy. They came to convince themselves on the basis of supply side indicators that the economy was recovering. You've shown by looking at consumer sentiment that actually demand has collapsed. And that in terms of how people feel, the important thing is most households have told you that they feel poorer than they did a year ago. As you said, it's safe to assume that well over 97% of Indian households have suffered a real loss of income.
That's right. I think we should not announce success too early. So, supply side indicators were looking good, but the demand side indicators weren't good enough, and we should have woken up to that. And what you just said, 97% of households are most likely suffering a fall in real income, inflation adjusted income, comes from the same data that we collect. We ask people, uh, what is your household's income today compared to a year ago? Is it better, worse, or the same? Only 3% of the households told us in the last few weeks that their incomes were better than a year ago. Only 3%. And this is in nominal terms, not in inflation adjusted terms. 55% said they are worse than a year ago, and the remaining 42% or so said that they are the same. The same means if you have inflation of around 6% or so, you're lost in real terms. So 55% have lost in nominal terms, which is really bad. Another 42% have lost in real terms, which is also bad. And the remaining 3% are probably okay, and we are not sure whether it is in real terms okay or not. So 97% of the people have lost income in the last 1 year. So obviously, demand is in big danger.
And this is why looking at consumer sentiment gives you a real picture of the state of the economy. If you look at supply side high frequency indicators, you end up believing actually we're recovering nicely, and everything is on check for a surge back. But the second you look at demand in terms of consumer sentiment, you realize, and I'm going to quote to you, that these figures actually are bad news for the economy. You write, if households are feeling poorer and if they see great risks to their well-being, they are not going to spend enthusiastically. Consequently, demand constraints will pose a challenge to the recovery process.
That's right. This is a big worry. India had a demand constraint many years ago before the 1992 liberalization. We overcame that, and the great Indian market is what India has been sold to international investors. And that's what brings in lots of investments. But if the demand side is crumbling, if poverty is increasing, if people are getting impoverished in a big way, then obviously the demand story is lost. And that one very important tool that we have to spur the economy into higher growth rates and bring people out of poverty, bring in uh, uh, what the aspirational India is looking for is all compromised. So we need to worry really hard about demand not being good. It's really bad for the economy.
In fact, collapsing demand, as indicated by consumer sentiment, is bad news for domestic investors. They'll see no reason to invest. It's bad news for foreigners wanting to invest. They'll see no need to come to this market. In fact, it suggests that the Indian market is not going to provide the impetus either internally or by inviting in foreign investment. The government, on the other hand, is constantly talking about the high speed indicators that we mentioned, all of which are supply side. Does the government realize, or is the government aware of this collapse in consumer sentiment? Or does it ignore it?
I think, although I do not know firsthand, I don't think the government does not know or is not aware or is not concerned about this falling consumer sentiments. I don't think they are so blind. I think it's more about the narrative. It's about what do you present to people? Do you tell people, should the government tell people, oh my God, this is a terrible situation, we need to worry like hard? Strategically, they seem to be saying, let's build a positive narrative. And if they are trying to build in some positivity in this extremely negative environment, they wouldn't like to publicly say, oh, yes, we do see that the CMI is saying that consumer sentiments are going down and unemployment is going high up. So it's not, it's a lack of public acknowledgement. I don't think they don't see it otherwise.
Okay, they're presenting a rosy picture. They hope that by doing so, they're buoying up the country spirits. But the truth, as you revealed, is that that rosy picture is not the truth. There is a more damaging reality, which is the collapse in demand reflected by consumer sentiment, which the government doesn't talk about. It's there. Investors know it exists. People who depend upon selling their goods know it exists, but the government is not talking about it. Let's at this point come to the second basis on which you analyze the economy. I'm now talking about unemployment. You write that for the week ending May the 23rd, unemployment touched 14.7%. In April, for the month of April, it was 8%. And you believe that when you have the figures for the full month of May, and they'll come in 3-4 days' time, it will have crossed 10%. Now, what does this level of unemployment mean for the economy?
It's obviously not a good sign. It means that the economy is unable to generate sufficient jobs for those people who are looking for it. Increasingly, people who are looking for jobs are not able to find jobs. And I think it's worse than that. It's about people who have jobs losing jobs. So it's both sides. Number one, you will always have more and more people coming into the labor market as young people graduate or they come of age and they would like to look for jobs. If you don't deliver jobs to them, then the unemployment rate will rise. But it can be worse than that. And it is true that jobs are also being lost. So the high unemployment rate, India was never used to looking at 6% or even 7 or even 5%. We traditionally had 2 to 3% unemployment rate. It's in the recent past 10 years or so, we have seen this rate go up to around 6%. And now it's touching 10% and even crossing that.
In fact, let me elaborate on the basis of your own organization's data, how bad the situation is. The distressing thing is that unemployment is rising not because more people are looking for jobs, because the labor participation rate has stayed more or less stable. Unemployment is rising because employment has fallen. In other words, jobs that existed have been lost. And your data shows that between April and May, 10 million jobs were lost. Between January and April, a further 10 million were lost, which means in the first 5 months of this year, actually, to be honest, first 4.5 months, 20 million jobs have been lost. That, to a layman, sounds like an awful lot of jobs to be lost so quickly.
Yes, that's an awful lot of jobs to be lost so quickly. And we need to worry about that. But let me put a small little, flavor to that. Some of those jobs lost, particularly in the month of April, were of people employed in the agricultural sector. And they lost their jobs because they are like daily wage earners, agricultural laborers, because of that lean month when the Rabi crop was harvested and the kharif sowing had still not begun. Approximately 7 million people came out of the agricultural sector. Hopefully, they will get their jobs back in the month of May or maybe June. So this is the lean period that does cause a little bit of up and down over here. The economy should do better to absorb them in other kind of jobs, but the economy is in a very bad shape. They cannot absorb them. So I think it's likely that the month of May will end with another 10 million jobs lost, very high likelihood. And we have 10 million jobs lost already. So we may have 20 million jobs lost. That's really very high.
In fact, when you dig deeper into the unemployment situation, you discover that unemployment is rising both in urban India and in rural India. In urban India, you believe for the month of May, and the figures will be available in 4 or 5 days' time, unemployment in urban India will have crossed into double digits. It will be above 10%. But it's rural India that actually is surprising, because you say the average unemployment in rural India tends to be around 6%, but for the week ending May the 23rd, it had increased to 9.7%. Now, some of that may be because the Rabi harvesting is over, as you explained, and there is a lean period and people are out of jobs. But is this entire increase to 9.7% explained in that way, or is there still a residual amount, and a fairly sizable residual amount, that cannot be explained and is very worrying?
It is worrying. The urban and rural breakup is worrying. Rural unemployment rate should not be higher than 6%. It should be much lower because agriculture absorbs a lot of disguised employment, which actually is disguised unemployment in the numbers. So when we see unemployment rising in rural India, it's really worrisome. That means even the least paying jobs, the least productive jobs are also not available now. So the distress is very high when rural sectors, rural regions also show high unemployment. Urban, you have no place to escape. If you are looking for a job, you cannot be sitting on the farm and saying, I'm employed. An unemployed person in urban India is unemployed, and the rate over there is rising dramatically. We track it every day, and yesterday it was touching 14%. So every day means this is a 30-day moving average, and the 30-day moving average yesterday was 14%. So that's really going very high now.
Let's drill a little further and deeper into that rural unemployment figure. We believe this was true last year of the first wave. Certainly, it's true, the government hopes, of the second wave, that agricultural production and growth will keep the economy going. And we're already talking about record output from the Rabi crop, and we're hoping for a very good Kharif crop. But if rural unemployment is growing, that means rural incomes will be falling. And if rural incomes are falling, rural demand will be affected. And so the impetus that rural demand gives to the rest of the economy could be missing this time. Isn't that one other corollary of the fact that rural unemployment is quite high, because it will have this effect on the rest of the economy?
You're right. It will have a major impact upon the rest of the economy because oftentimes in the last few years, FMCG companies or consumer durables companies tell us that demand is very good in rural India. Rural India is only partly agriculture. There is also the non-agricultural part, which is there in rural India, which is not small. And what we see, and this is the troublesome part in this, is that a large part of the jobs that were lost in the month of April, non-agricultural jobs in rural India, were of salaried employees. Now, this is MSME sector losing jobs, blue-collared workers working in small factories in rural India were losing their jobs in a big way. This is the slowdown and the pandemic going into rural India showing up in stress in rural India as well. So I think this is going to be really troublesome for the economy going ahead.
So just as your in-depth analysis of consumer sentiment showed up that by relying on high-speed supply-side indicators, the government was presenting a false or needlessly rosy picture of the economy. Similarly, by drilling into unemployment, you're also showing that, in fact, things are nowhere near as reassuring as the government's presentation based upon supply-side figures suggest. Both consumer sentiment and unemployment present a very different picture of the future, and it's a much more worrying one, because if sentiment is falling, it's not easy to revive. If households are losing jobs and incomes, they will not want to spend, and that will have a critical impact right across the economy, not just in rural India, not just in urban India, but all the way across.
You are right. And if the government is showing a rosy picture by looking at the supply side indicators, that story will not last long, because the April numbers of many fast frequency indicators has started showing a slowing down. Automobiles, steel have shown sharp decline. Of course, part of this is because of diversion of oxygen for medical purposes from industrial use. But whichever way, because of the pandemic, because of the lack of vaccination, because of the way we have managed the economy is showing signs of stress even on the supply side. So the demand side is showing a story, was showing a story. It is best for us to take cognizance of that, be aware that we're going to run into rough weather very soon. The supply side will start showing the numbers, which paint a grim picture of the economy pretty soon.
Let's at this point, Mr. Vyas, try and paint a broader picture, relying upon what you've told us just now about consumer sentiment and unemployment, and add to it the fear, or maybe I should even say the panic, that the second surge created in many people right across the country. As a result, would you say there's a lot more uncertainty and a much greater loss of confidence this time round compared to at the end of the first wave?
Oh, yes. Um, I would say that the one of the biggest uncertainties we had then has gone. We do have vaccines available. So the biggest uncertainty then was, when will we get the vaccine? That's gone. But we have got greater uncertainties now. We've got greater risk now, even though the biggest uncertainty of the vaccine is over. So people do not know when will the economy revive. Industrialists do not know when demand will revive and therefore are not putting up capacities. They're running capacities at 66%. So they are employing lesser people than they should be. So the economy is kind of getting into a grinding halt in a sense. I mean, how low can we go in terms of capacity utilization and demand not picking up? So I think there is a fairly large danger, not only from the households in terms of unemployment and consumer sentiments, but even industry. There is a bit of a complication here because large industries are still making a lot of money, even when the economy is not doing well. This quarter ended March 2021. They will see their best profit ever. And the previous quarter, they had seen a big best profit ever. And the previous one also, they had seen their best profit ever. So you have this dichotomy that the large listed companies are doing well, industry as a whole is doing badly, and the economy is doing badly. This is something that we have to get out of.
Absolutely, and that's the paradox. Large listed companies are making more money, more profit than they have for a long, long time. But not just industry as a whole is doing badly, demand is collapsing, consumer sentiment is sinking, and people are not spending. And therefore, this will hit large industry eventually as well. They may be making a lot of money today, but the future, if demand continues to collapse, is not going to be rosy for them either.
The most important thing, Karan, over here before is that they are not investing. They are making a lot of money, but they're not investing. If they're not investing, their own growth will slow down eventually, and they know it. So it's bad for everyone.
Now, against this background, I want to cite to you a couple of recent growth estimates that were put out, firstly by Barclays and secondly by State Bank of India just a couple of days ago. Both of them have independently concluded that the estimate they have of the hit to the economy this time around is actually much more, much deeper than they initially thought. In other words, with every day that the second lockdown continues, with every day that the effect of this horrible surge dominates our lives, people are realizing the impact will be much worse than we first thought it would be.
I agree with their finding. CMI has the same finding as well. We were not as gung ho as many others were in the beginning of the year. So on the 1st of April 2021, we had predicted that the economy will grow by 9.7%. And most people around that time were talking in terms of 11.5% or so. We have brought down our 9.7% down to 8.7%. And we are likely to revise that further down to 8% pretty soon. We are talking in terms of 8% now, although the official number on our site is still 8.7, which means that we are not going to cross the level of the economy that was there last year.
Absolutely. And what you're saying echoes what Dr. Rangarajan, a former governor of the RBI, and Dr. Manmohan Singh's Economic Advisory Council chairman said in an article in the Hindu 2-3 days ago. He too believes that the rate of growth of the economy this year will not take it back to pre-pandemic levels. That means that there are serious concerns and doubts about whether the government can achieve Nirmala Sitharaman's budgeted revenue forecasts, her fiscal projections, and the budgeted expenditure. All of those now are in doubt.
They certainly are in doubt. The budget was made before we recognized that there is the second pandemic around the corner, before the pandemic actually played itself out. So, obviously, that was a very different set of circumstances in which the budget was made. The expectation then was we had this deep decline last year. Now we will just have a low base and get a high growth like 10, 11, 12%. That's all gone wrong. Tax collections are going to be much lower. The deficit will be much higher. Growth is going to be much lower. So it is a very different situation, requires us to recalibrate, re strategize what should the way forward be.
In fact, it's possible the situation may be even one degree worse. And I'm quoting now Sajid Chinoy, a member of Mr. Modi's Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. He has written in the Business Standard, and I'm quoting, the suddenness and sheer viciousness of the second wave could inflict behavioral scars over the coming months. In other words, the impact of the wave, the loss of confidence, the fear that it created, the uncertainty means that the way people behave, their perceptions, their attitude, their expectations will all have changed. That, if it is true, would suggest that this is the real big difference between the impact of the first wave on the economy and the second wave.
It's very nice and very good for Sajid to raise a very important point, which is a subject of great interest in the economists of the day, the world over. Behavioral economics, behavioral science, and the impact of such a huge scar that the economy has suffered because of the pandemic. The impact on people who have been pushed back into poverty, people who are aspiring to come out of poverty, people who were in the middle income, lower middle income category, aspiring to rise up. They were looking for the future. Imagine households, their children coming out of their graduation, getting jobs. So many households have been badgered badly. So many of them have seen their people die around them. So the scars are going to be with us for a very long time. Talking just in terms of fast frequency indicators is really hollow. And it's important for us to take into account not just consumer sentiments, but even the behavioral aspects that Sajid draws attention to.
In fact, as you said a moment ago in one of your answers, the only real hope we hope is mass vaccination. Now, despite everything the government says, the reality is we're not going to be in a position to mass vaccinate our people till at least November, December, because we simply do not have the vaccines and they will not be available. And even question marks are being raised in papers as we speak, that the announcements made about the quantity that we will have in July, August, September are not so, because Covaxin alone requires 4 months to be able to produce from start to finish. So if we cannot mass vaccinate till December, can we have meaningful economic growth this year? Or are we going to have to write off this year just as we wrote off last year as well?
In reality, it looks like we are writing off this year. In reality, technically, we will see a growth rate because statistically, it's a very low base we had last year, like a 28% fall in the first quarter will give rise to some growth statistically, but that's hardly meaningful. It's not meaningful at all. So I think this year is quite a washout.
So this is 2 years of bad news for the Indian economy, and we need to begin to say to ourselves, our great hopes of becoming a $5 trillion economy are not improving and increasing. They are receding, if not stalled.
Well, that's the 5 trillion economy is more or less gone, at least in the time span in which the Prime Minister had expected it to come up. But that's not even important. I think what's important is to get the fear of the disease out of our way. It's critically important to ensure that people don't die because of the virus, don't die because of lack of health services, lack of oxygen. I think that is the most important thing. Growth is secondary. I think it's very important that we ensure that people live and then have livelihoods. Growth will come eventually, but right now the focus has to be that the government should spend. first to ensure that people don't die, people don't get hit for life. A lot of people who have survived have got problems that they seem to be surviving for several months. So it's not just about survival, it's a lot more than that. So I think it's urgently required. Don't let this crisis go as a waste. Fix our health system. Fix our health system for a long time to come.
Fixing the health system is absolutely vital and critical, but it can't be done overnight. It could take several years to do. The dependence of the country on reviving hope, on reviving its spirits, hinges on vaccines, but we also know they're not going to be available in a mass number till December. The government's ridiculous incompetence in handling vaccine, and I'm using those words deliberately, is to blame, but there's no point going into that either because it's a story we know. So leaving that aside, what is it that the government should do to the extent it can to revive consumer sentiment and hopefully to shore up employment? What is it that it can do?
It needs to recognize that this is now a macroeconomic problem. It's not about targeted relief. It's not about giving food to those who cannot eat don't have the next meal. It's not about that. It's not about band-aid to the really, really very poor. That's not going to help. That's going to help in a very, very limited way to ensure that a person gets his or her next meal. What is important is to see that if the government does not spend large amounts of money and let the deficit rise to ensure that people have money in their hands and demand is revived in a classic Keynesian manner, the time has come. The time is well past, actually. We should have done it many, many months ago. The best thing to do right now is for the government to spend and spend a lot to ensure that jobs are created, demand is created, and jobs are created on a sustainable basis.
So
So
can I sum it
there's
up?
no other way out.
Can I sum it up like this? It's vaccinate, vaccinate, vaccinate when you have the vaccine, but sadly you may not for many, many months. Before that, it's spend, spend, spend. In classic Keynesian fashion, let the deficit rise. It's not a problem. You've got to spend because you have to revive demand, because you have to push up consumer sentiments, because if you don't, the false picture being created by supply-side high-speed indicators will soon become an illusion and disappear like a puff of air, and then you'll be stranded. Is that a correct way of summing it up, even if it's a bit catchy and exaggerated?
You put it very well. It sounds very nice and is also very correct.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Vyas. Thank you for this interview, and thank you in particular for opening our eyes to a better way of seeing the economy rather than simply in terms of high-speed supply-side indicators. Consumer sentiment and demand are not just an indication of the state of the economy, but also the state of the people. When consumer sentiment falls, people are getting disheartened. Not only are they worried about their present, they're also losing hope in a bright future. And that is not something any country can afford for long. Thank you very much indeed. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you.